time has come for us to venture into the modes. For this little modes mini-series, we're gonna spend the next 7 videos covering the 7 modes of the major scale. And we're gonna kick it off by focusing on the most important mode of them all, the Ionian mode, aka the major scale. This is the scale that all the 7 modes derive from. So obviously it'd be important to understand the most foundational mode of them all, and whether or not you actually find the major scale relevant to something that you would, let's say, use out in the wild as a musician, whether you're recording or playing live or whatever. It's still a very important foundational framework for you because it actually feeds into like understanding song structures and like the Nashville number system, all that stuff. So don't shy away from the major scale. And just to illustrate a validating point for my personal experience when I realized how important the major scale is, I took a lesson from Reggie Wooten. And if you don't know who he is, he's the older brother of Victor Wooten, arguably the best bass player alive. And that whole family is just, they're all just incredible, just musical savants, genius level in my opinion, and they're wonderful people. And I got a chance to have a couple lessons with Reggie. And Reggie was not shy about talking about how important the major scale is. In fact, that was all he focused on and everything that kind of derived from it. So in the spirit of that, I want to say that was a very validating point for me to realize that the major scale is something not to shy away from. So we're going to spend some time focusing on that, and we're going to see how it actually is relevant when it comes to the other 6 modes. So this is going to be a very bare bones introduction on what the modes are and a way that we can actually use them to enrich our playing. So we're going to take less of an academic approach and more of a just ear training approach, if you will, so that we can utilize our sense of melody to make these modes actually work for us in creating melodies and musical ideas. Now, if you were to ask me to sum up the modes in one word, I would quote the great Frank Gambale, who said that they should actually be called moods, because that's really what they do, is they convey a certain mood. Each mode has its own emotion, right? So that's, I feel like, the best approach. That's why I'm gonna take this ear training sort of approach with this next 7 video series of getting used to the modes and getting acquainted with them and really what mood they convey, so that when we're trying to convey a mood like that or something similar, we actually have a tool to get us there. And the last thing before we get started to understand about the modes is they have funny names. They're named after, I think, ancient Greek islands. So we're starting with the Ionian mode, which is the major scale, as I said. So let's dive right into it. What we're gonna be doing is focusing on a single key for all of these modes. So every video that we do on the modes, we're gonna be focusing on one key, which is the key of E. And the reason for that is because we have the luxury of droning out this low E string, which is gonna be very useful for us when we're actually trying to get to know each mode note for note. So starting with the Ionian mode in E, right? Now, as you know, major scale, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That's what it is. So we're gonna start with the 7th fret on the A string, then the 9th fret, then we have 6th fret on D, 7 on D, 9 on D, then we have 6 on G, 7 on G, and those 7 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, are what make up the scale. And then of course we have our upper octave here, just for the sake of resolution, which is on the 9th fret of the G string. So the major scale and all the modes are what are called diatonic scales. So 7 note scales, as opposed to pentatonic, which we may be already pretty familiar with, right? Which is a 5 note scale. Diatonic scale rather is a 7 note scale. So those are our 7 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And each note, right, is numbered specifically, right? So when you think about scale degrees, we have our 1st, our 2nd, our 3rd, our 4th, our 5th, our 6th, and our 7th, right? And then of course octave. So anytime you hear someone referencing like, oh, the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th or whatever, right? They're talking about the notes in the scale. Most often they're talking about the major scale because everything is just kind of derived from the major scale. Basically, if you take a different, and you'll see this when we get into the other modes, but when you take a different scale, right, you can reference it back to being basically the major scale with just a couple notes rearranged. So you'll notice that when we get into the other modes. So that's like the foundational framework is the major scale. We have that, obviously that 1st, a 2nd, that 3rd, major 3rd, right? our fourth and fifth. The fourth and fifth are typically known as perfect intervals because I think it's partly because of the way that they, the kind of tension that they have in relation to the root note, but also the fact that most scales, not all, but most scales share that fourth and fifth interval too, whether it's major or minor or whatever kind of mode. And then you have our sixth and our seventh. Now, how we're going to get musically acquainted with this scale is we're immediately going to approach it without the linear go up and down the scale. We're not going to do that because that's immediately going to set up a bad habit of just walking up and down the scale, and you're not really using it musically, you're just exercising it. When you exercise the scale, you convey musical information, but it doesn't really, it's like having a bunch of words jumbled up and you don't really know how to communicate them, so you just kind of verbal diarrhea them, but at the, the receiver doesn't understand what you're saying. So you want to obviously add some linguistics and some speech, right? When it comes to actually conveying the message with those words. So you can think of the notes in a similar way, right? We want to be able to convey a musical message, and it doesn't even have to be that grandiose, like just some kind of musical idea, small little expression. We want to be able to convey that, but we don't really convey that if we're just doing this. This is not like me authentically conveying music to you right now by doing that, right? So we're going to nix that completely. Learn the scale, how to play it, where it is on the fretboard, and then that's it, right? Don't sit there and exercise it to the point where that's all you approach it with, Obviously, you can do the exercise to get your fingers going, but what we're really gonna do, the most important thing, and this is where the ear training comes in, is we're gonna learn how to actually get to know each individual note and how it clashes with the root note. Its relation to the root note is how you kind of understand what kind of tension it gives you. So let's start. Obviously we have our first, which is our root, which, E, it's gonna sound like the most resolute, right? It's our home base, right? So remember, we wanna be able to drone that low E string so we can hear that reference, right? Then we go to the second. Ooh. Now, that's definitely given tension, right? More tension than that, right? But it feels like it wants to go somewhere, That's what I like about second scale degrees, they really are nice bridge notes. They just kind of want to, they want to go somewhere, right? And then we move on to the third. Ooh, that sounds pretty. This is where it starts to sound melodic, right? There's like, the thirds are very important in most scales because they can really illustrate and paint a picture, not just in melody, but also in chord forming and all that stuff. So thirds are nice. We go to the fourth. Ooh. Sounds nice, right? The fifth. Very nice. I like the sort of frequency between the root and the fifth. It feels less wobbly in the frequency. I mean, I don't know, I'm kind of weird. I hear frequencies and I kind of hear the waveforms. I mean, it's like when you tune a guitar like this. It goes out of tune, you hear that weird wobble, right? And you bring it in tune, the wobbling stops and it evens out. So like that's what I'm talking about when I say I hear the frequency. So you try to do the same, even if you don't find yourself very sensitive to frequency, right? Or maybe you don't know you are, you can kind of hear, ooh, definitely hear a wobble with that. That's the sixth degree. That's a cool sound. And then our seventh. Very interesting. And then come to our octave, goes back to resolving. So every note has its own thing, its own vibe, right? And so we can actually, once we get to know that on a fundamental level, get to know every single note and the vibe it gives us, that further feeds into that information that we need to learn how to navigate through a scale in a way that conveys a musical idea or an emotion or a mood. And another point I want to make about scales just in general, I became a little infamous a couple years ago putting out ads telling people to stop using scales. And if you actually, got past that sort of clickbaity, headlining messaging, what I was saying was, don't get caught in that trap where all scales is, all you're essentially doing is just thinking in terms of scales and not thinking in terms of melody. right? Because I can tell you with 100% certainty, every guitar player that I've ever had the chance to interact with that I look up to, right? And let's say they'd play something that was just like phenomenal. And I'm like, what was that lick you played? Or what was that, and I get the chance to ask them these questions. 100% of the time, when they look back and they're like, oh yeah, I was just doing kind of this thing, whatever here. What that told me was that in the moment when they did it, they weren't thinking in terms of scales. They weren't thinking, okay, now I will go into the Ionian mode and then let this idea come out. That's not what they were thinking. This actual scale, the actual like breaking it down from like a theory perspective was an afterthought. So the forethought, the first thing they were thinking was melody, right? It's like they come up with that idea in their head, and then they play it. They're not thinking, I'm gonna come up with a major scale melody. It's not that calculating usually, right? And if it is, it kind of takes the magic out of it. You know what I mean? Like, so anytime I would see something that just really moved me and it was just a melody that was just incredible, right? I would just really want to know what they were thinking. And every single time I would get that feedback from them, they would say, I wasn't really thinking about the scale. I was just, the melody kind of came to me and I thought it up and then I played it. So that tells me that that's kind of the timeline of the order of things. It's like, yes, you got to learn the scales. You have to, right? And you're going to be playing notes in a scale regardless, duh. But you don't want to be forward thinking as far as scales go. That shouldn't be on the forefront of your mind. That should be more of an afterthought. So if you break down and analyze what you did, you can understand from a theory perspective what scales you were using, et cetera, et cetera. But in the moment, when you're in that moment of musical expression, you were thinking in terms of melody. And in order to come up with melodies, right? If let's say you're like, okay, that makes sense, but I don't even know how to come up with melody. It comes down to listening, active listening, and we're actively listening to the notes in every single note in this mode and in the other modes in the subsequent videos we're going to do, so that way we get to know how we can weave melody. So let's talk about how we can actually do that. Now, if let's say you're like, okay, but I still don't know what kind of melody I'm going to come up with. I'm going to be in the trap of just doing that, right? There's a cool little trick you can do. It's called wandering, where you essentially just play random notes in the scale and you really focus on breaking that pattern of playing linear. So once you get to know, and it's another actually a way to further get to know the notes, because there might be, let's say, two notes in particular that if you play them in a certain order are really tense and cool and can inspire you, but you won't know that unless you kind of stumble on them. And wandering is the perfect way to do that, because by doing this, you're not going to stumble on cool note ideas, right? Like if I only play the major scale like that, I'm never going to discover that actually these notes, like that order of notes, I never would be able to discover that if all I did was just play the scale up and down, right? So let's wander a little bit, right? I'm going to play the low E string. And so I'm going to tell you exactly what was happening right there, because that was just off the cuff. I'm just kind of rolling with it. I started off by wandering, like the first 3 or 4 notes I wandered, but then I could kind of hear something happening. I was like, okay, I can see where this is going. And then I heard in my head these notes to resolve it, right? That is literally what was happening in real time just now. So the wandering part kicked off the thing where it's like, I can't come up with an idea. Let me just wander and stumble on something, right? And I did. And I stumbled on something, and then it gave me like half a melody, and then I was able to complete the other half in a more creative, authentic way that was on purpose for me, because I wouldn't have come up with that though, like if it was not because of the wandering. So that's how great of a trick this is, right? So let's do some more. Let's keep this going. So let me start on a weird degree. Let me start on the sixth, right? Ooh, okay. Where does it want to go from here? Let's see. I'm not sure. Let me just keep wandering. Okay. So right there, those were wandered notes, and then I was like, I heard I heard that in my head. The wandering inspired those last 2 notes, and then it came out, right? It's like that perfect strategy of just kind of winging it, like shooting in the dark, and then being like, oh, cool, I got something, grabbing it, and then making it your own, Everything I'm doing, by the way, with this is all in real time, off the cuff. None of these were pre-existing ideas. I'm trying to really illustrate and drive home the point of how useful wandering is. So let's do one more example. So let's say, okay, I'll start on the second, right? Because that's a nice tension on the second, and I like the fact that it feels like a bridge note, like it wants to go somewhere. So let's try that. Okay, there's the fifth there. That's pretty cool. Okay, so I did a lot of wandering there. I was just trying stuff out, which is the best thing you can do when you're in this sort of like, living room phase of just being at home, figuring this stuff out, experimenting, trying stuff out. Because when you do that, you're gonna stumble on some melodies and some like sort of specific navigations of the notes of the scale where you're like, that sounded cool, I like that. Let me archive that, and then you turn it into a lick. Right? So in the future, when you're playing like a major scale kind of lick, you're not thinking in terms of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You're thinking in like, okay, I'm gonna do something cool. That's pretty, right? And you can do any order you want. That's the cool thing about wandering, is like you're just playing random notes in the scale in a random order, and just let that inspire new ideas. And you just saw how that actually works in real time. So I want you to do the same thing. And a final point I want to make, not just about the major scale or any of the modes, like literally this applies to any scale, any musical approach to creating ideas, right? Is whenever you learn a new scale pattern or a new chord shape, anything like that, right? It's like if I were to give you a set of tools and I'm like, this is a bandsaw, I can do this. This is a drill, I can do this, right? I gave you all these tools and they're awesome. They're like the best tools you can possibly use. Like they are the choice picks. I give them to you and you have no idea how to use them. It does you no good, right? No matter how awesome those tools are, it does you no good if you don't know how to use them. So you want to think of the scales and chord shapes, all that stuff. It's the same idea, right? You're given these tools and they are tools meant to be used. You know, I could sit there and try to use a drill as a hammer, but it's like, not really gonna work out, right? So you wanna think of it that way. Everything kind of has its own purpose. And I mean, that comes down to your own specific personal purpose, because music is a personal thing. How you express yourself musically may not be exactly how I express myself musically. And that's the beauty of it. So this is just a way for you to kind of have a neutral approach to not only discovering what makes scales tick, because this is the approach we're gonna take with everything that we learn subsequently as far as scales, but just being able to really understand how to use them for the tools that they are. By the way, everything that I have told you thus far is exactly what I wish I was told when I was first learning scales. Like approaching them in this way to understand how I can immediately use them in a practical application that's relevant to me. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had people reach out to me say like, I know how to play XYZ scales in every position on the fretboard, but nothing I play sounds good. Or it's all just mechanical. Like, how can I break out of that, right? This is exactly what we're trying to prevent with this particular series. Well, I mean, really with all these lessons, but it's like trying to break you out of that rut of, or that potential rut even, of just learning the patterns and you can play them up and down, but just you're unable to convey anything musically authentic. So we're gonna take this very minimalistic, very bare bones approach to all of the modes from this point forward. And in the next video, we're gonna be getting into the second mode of the 7 modes, which is the Dorian mode. I'll see you there.